Chapter 15, Year 5, Part 5. "Well, guys," Harry said, voice amplified by sonorous. "This has been a very eventful week." He estimated there to be about 100 people in the hidden room, give or take a few. Of course not everyone in the dueling club was equally loyal to him, and not all were particularly skilled, but they were here, and some of them had been here since the very beginning. These people had been willing to believe him about Voldemort's return prior to the official confirmation thereof. Granted, they had also joined out of hatred for Umbridge and desire to learn defence, but they had still supported Harry over the Ministry. That had to count for something. Whatever happens next, I believe that we have a reason to celebrate. As I am sure all of you have noticed, today's prophet reported the complete and final revocation of Umbridge's educational decrees. Considering where our dear former professor is residing now, we can cheerfully proclaim ourselves free of her dictatorial rule. I think I speak for all of us when I say, good riddance. A wave of applause swelled in the audience. Quite a few looks were thrown at the Weasley twins. The rumours of their involvement in Umbridge's breakdown and subsequent hospitalization must have spread already, although there had been no formal announcement. Harry sighed inwardly and addressed the audience again. "While it is undoubtedly a good thing, the reason for the Ministry's change of heart is much more serious." He paused amid sudden silence. "We have known of Voldemort's return for a long time. As of a few days ago, the Ministry has finally acknowledged it as well. They are no longer denying the truth, which is a great improvement on what they were doing before." Despite the optimistic content of Harry's words, the listeners must have caught an underlying "but" to the whole message. Nobody was clapping now. "At the same time, Voldemort has no reason to hide any longer. In a sense, the Ministry's acknowledgement is a declaration of war. We can expect the war to be out on the open from now on, and it's not going to be pleasant." Cedric and other older students nodded grimly. Some of the younger kids, conversely, seemed almost excited. "Now, more than ever, we must remain united," Harry pronounced with conviction. "The dueling club has done really well this year. We stood strong against Umbridge, and I'm personally grateful to all of you for the support you gave me when I had to face certain unpleasantness from a segment of the school. We've all learned a lot. The older ones will be able to pass our exams with good marks, and the younger ones are now capable of basic self-defense. Perhaps most importantly," and Harry's voice rang out clearly and firmly as he said these words, "we have forged great bonds of friendship. Whatever the circumstances led to us creating this club, I know that I'm thankful for the opportunity to have got to know you all. I dearly hope that the dueling club will not fade out of existence simply because Umbridge is no longer among us to fight against. I am convinced that, together, we can achieve great things." Once again Harry was subjected to a thunderous ovation. The overwhelming consensus was that, obviously, the dueling club should last forever and ever, because it was the best thing since pumpkin juice. And Harry should have known it was coming. He'd got off easy till this point, but of course it was coming. "Will you tell us about the duel at the Ministry?" someone shouted. "How did you defeat you-know-who? Is it true that you're the only one who can beat him?" Harry waited for the shouts to die down before answering. "I have not defeated Voldemort," he said, inserting a cool note into his voice to imply that such a suggestion was ridiculous. "Please make no mistake. It is true that I have set him back once again, to his great annoyance, no doubt." He gave a humourless smile and surveyed the hushed crowd. There was something absurd in him standing here now, and explaining himself before this group of children, when he could still see so clearly in his mind's eye Voldemort in the golden dome of ancient magic, and fading green shadows of deadly curses in the air. Why was he still even allowed to be at school among these kids, when he was capable of killing people? At times he honestly didn't know. "I wish, although it is too late, that you had not known half those spells. I wish that your soul had remained as bright and pure as it was when you defeated an ancient basilisk with a sword and a phoenix song." They were still looking at him, and Harry floundered for a moment, unable to recall what they were waiting for. He'd been saying something, but then he'd fallen so deep into thoughts of darker times and other places. "Voldemort," he began, because he was fairly sure he'd been talking about Voldemort, "is not going to be defeated easily, and I'm going to need all of you with me if I want to achieve anything at all." Although there was no celebratory whooping this time, it was very clear that the speech-giving part of the meeting was over. The crowd at first struck silent, then sighed, and murmured and dispersed. There were still looks thrown Harry's way, but no more questions followed, which was just as well. Harry suddenly didn't feel like answering any. "Are you all right?" Cedric asked, coming up to Harry once he'd jumped off the podium. "Yeah, sure," Harry said, but Cedric was still frowning. "Something on your mind?" "Nothing much," Cedric shrugged. "I just can't help thinking that this is not a great year for me to graduate. Not for the Weasley twins, for that matter. I mean, I'm not sure how much help we've been, but I'd feel better if I wasn't leaving at this juncture." Harry hadn't thought that far into the future, actually, but it was true that once Cedric graduated, Harry would lose one of his greatest allies at Hogwarts. Cedric was great help in running the dueling club, and, as head boy, imbued Harry with authority he might not otherwise have had. With him and the twins gone, it was going to be quite a different next year. "Well, you're going to be a very useful spy at the Ministry in any case," Harry said. "Assuming they accept your application, which I don't see why they wouldn't, with your grades and your dad working for them too." "I should do fine on the defence newt at least," Cedric said with a quirk of lips. "As could you, probably. But yes, I'll likely get accepted, for all the good it'll do. The Ministry's on our side now, anyway, or as close as they will get to it." "Which is not too close," Harry murmured. "Of course, a lot will depend on Scrimgeour." The freshly elected Minister for Magic sounded like he might be competent, seeing as he'd headed auras in the past. Harry would watch his first steps carefully, but he had hopes. Rather ambitious ones, actually. But hey, he was a Slytherin. He was meant to be like that. "Anyway," Cedric said, "I suppose you've heard about Ollivander? What do you think?" "I try not to," Harry replied darkly, grimacing. "I wish we had protected him. Not like it was impossible to predict Voldemort's move." Frankly, Harry didn't think they'd be seeing the kidnapped Wandmaker ever again, and he couldn't believe that nobody had thought of that Voldemort would want to check why his wand hadn't worked against Harry's, and that Ollivander would be the first person to go to. Everybody had been so busy with the Ministry upheaval and the revelation of Voldemort's return and all. But Dumbledore and Harry, at least, knew about the Priori Incantatem, and should have thought of the implications. "So, you also believe that Voldemort is looking into these unknown magics in your duel, like the newspapers say?" Cedric uttered thoughtfully. "You don't sound too worried about what he can learn." "No," Harry said, "not worried in those terms, because very likely Voldemort won't learn much from Ollivander than I have from Dumbledore. But you could say I'm pretty damn worried for Ollivander." That was the last thing said on the subject, however, because Harry spotted Susan moving towards them in the crowd, Hannah Abbott and Ernie Macmillan in tow. "Harry," Ernie said, before Susan could speak a word, "excellent speech. I wholly agree with the sentiment." "Thanks, Ernie," Harry answered, and smiled at Susan as she put a hand on his arm. We'll be off, I think," she said, addressing him only. "I've a lot of homework to do, and you're having your after-meeting thing, aren't you?" As usual, Harry would be seeing his friends in private after a general dueling club gathering. Boyfriend and girlfriends were not included on that. Harry had argued that he could not make an exception for Susan if he didn't also want to see Justin Finch-Fletchley and Cho Chang there. Susan had accepted his decision with good grace. After all, it wasn't like Harry was privy to all his secrets with Hannah and Ernie. "All right," Harry murmured, pecking Susan on the lips. "I'll see you later." "I do have to study tonight," Susan said, smiling as she looked him in the eyes. "Someone kept me from homework yesterday, and the day before." "Must have been a very evil person," Harry said, twirling her braid around his finger. "It was," Susan agreed. "A dark, mysterious Slytherin." "Oh, please don't," Hannah said, sounding nauseated. "This sweetness is more than a single girl can bear." Ernie patted her on the back in consolation. She batted his hand away, huffing. Cedric laughed. "Fine," Harry said, and kissed Susan again. "Good luck studying, okay?" "And good luck to you plotting world domination," Susan said amicably. "She knows you so well," Cedric observed in affected wonder. The cheerful atmosphere didn't survive long into the private meeting of Harry's friends. "And either must die at the hand of the other," Harry finished calmly, "for neither can live while the other survives." He regarded his friends. "That leaves us in a bit of a bind." Notably, even Blaise seemed too thrown by the prophecy to offer cavalier remarks right off the bat. Millicent was the first to recover, and went straight to business before anyone had tried to bemoan the magnitude and tragedy of the situation. "Have you discovered the power the Dark Lord knows not?" she inquired. Harry thought back to the ephemeral love that was meant to protect him. "I seriously hope not," he replied. "I could keep waiting for some amazing ability to manifest, like any day now would be good." "Your attempts at humour are entirely misplaced," Blaise informed him. In case you're forgetting, you are to save the world." "Very funny." "Yes, my feelings exactly." "And you're telling me, us, that you know who is aware of the prophecy," Anthony said in a tone that communicated both fascination and horror. "He knows he'll only live if you die, and vice versa." "That would explain the whole idea behind purposefully attacking a defenseless baby," Fred said. "And being defeated by said baby," George added. "I'm not sure whether it makes your legend wane or grow, Harrykins." Luna looked at them in mild interest. "I think Harry is still angry with you about Umbridge," she confided with her usual sense of tact. "I don't believe that you're making it better." Harry didn't look at either twin, but he could feel their fleeting glances on him. They were not, in fact, making it better. "Even if we assume that prophecies are real," Hermione said, her voice clearly conveying that she assumed no such thing, "everything supposedly hinges on what Trelawney said. Now, just how rational is it to—" "There have been prophecies," Padma said. "What? There have. And if you feel that you know more about divination than Professor Trelawney, well, that's not fine, but either way, it doesn't invalidate a whole branch of magic. Even Professor McGonagall thinks that divination is not a valid subject." "Regardless of that," Terry said loudly, "you know who has tried to kill Harry again and again. I'm gonna guess that he's taking this prophecy seriously. That means Harry's life is in danger, whether or not Trelawney is a fraud." "Are you going to tell Susan about the prophecy?" Neville asked in the silence that followed. "Not sure," Harry said. Was he? He didn't really want to. He treasured the peace and distance from the war that he experienced while with Susan. War was encroaching on the little world as it was, and he wasn't inclined to speed up the process. "How long have you known about the prophecy?" Padma asked, narrowing her eyes. "It can't be recent. You wouldn't have told us if it was. And I can't believe you just went around bottling it all up." "Knowing Harry, it could be years," Blaise said, observing him with clinical detachment. "And how did you find out?" Hermione asked. "Who told you?" "It's complicated," Harry said, making a vague hand gesture that was meant to somehow encompass the complications. He was not going to launch into the story of meeting his dead parents. Not now, and likely not ever. "Of course it's complicated," Terry said, hitting himself on the forehead. "I mean, how didn't I guess? When have things been simple around here?" Cedric listened to their conversations in silence that Harry couldn't help but wonder about. When he joined the discussion, he voiced, sure enough, one of those conclusions that Harry could practically hear forming in his head. "You knew," Cedric said, turning to Neville. "You've heard the prophecy before this, haven't you?" He's told you." All glances in the room were suddenly on Neville. "It could have been me," Neville said, speaking up for the first time. "My parents have also defied Voldemort 3 times, and my birthday is at the end of July. Voldemort was choosing between us then." Nobody had expected that. It was very obvious that nobody had expected that. Hermione, Padma, Blaise, Millicent, Cedric, Terry, Anthony, Fred, George, even Luna looked flabbergasted. This pronouncement seemed to shock them still more than the original revelation of the prophecy. Harry thought he could understand. He always got into trouble, he always ran into threats against his life, and Voldemort and death-defying adventures. It did not come as a surprise that there was an underlying explanation for this. Like Harry himself, his friends had almost expected the message of the prophecy, if not its form. Neville, however, stood to be seen in an entirely new light. Cedric gave a small, mirthless laugh. "And it could have been me back at the graveyard," he said, "taking the cup and going to Voldemort's rebirth instead of Harry." "The boys who weren't," Blaise said. Neville flinched. "I'll do my share in the war," he snapped. "Don't you even—" "Look," Harry said, without any idea how he was going to continue. He just knew that the conversation was getting alarmingly out of hand and needed to be redirected now. "Look, in the end, I told you all so that you'd be aware. You've always known what my life is like, I guess, but this is just so that you know. I'm not, expecting anyone to save me, or anyone, I'm expecting help, and I'm going to try and get help where I can." Harry frowned, willing the explanation to become clearer. "I already have, but—" "But you can't sit back and be a kid and let someone else take care of it all," Hedrick supplied carefully. "Because there will be no one, is that it?" Harry shrugged. That sounded awfully melodramatic. "There's going to be battles I'm going to have to fight." That was becoming all too clear lately. "I'm not saying I want to do it all alone, it's just—" "There's Dumbledore," Hermione interrupted. "Supposing for a moment that you won't defeat Voldemort, at the very least he'll help you and protect you while you're at Hogwarts." "Just as he's done so far," Millicent snarled. Hermione ignored her. "I don't care about the prophecy. I don't even believe— It can't be your responsibility to defeat Voldemort or fight or anything. You had nothing to do with starting this war. You shouldn't be the one everyone just piles things on." Harry had to look away from her blazing eyes, because he couldn't start thinking of how unfair this whole thing was. That way lay madness, and danger of a certain kind. "The struggle between you and the Dark Lord has never been a war of ideals. It is not your place to become a champion of Dumbledore's goals. You have nothing to gain by plunging yourself into a conflict that is much older than you." There were some truths he could not afford to think too deeply about if he wanted to retain any sense of direction at all. But he could also look at it in a different way. This wasn't only about Dumbledore's ideals or Voldemort's desire to kill Harry. It was also about Harry's stubborn determination to live. "I don't think that it is my responsibility to defeat anyone, per se," Harry said. "But in many ways, fighting is my choice, no less than Dumbledore's or Voldemort's. Like I said, I'm not expecting anyone to make it better. And I'd ask you not to, either." Somehow, that wrapped up the entire meeting. Harry's friends departed from the hidden room, clearly weighed down by the enormity of the revelations. Harry felt a little guilty for inflicting the weight of knowledge on them, but on the other hand it was somewhat overdue already. They had to be made aware. Everyone filtered out, but the twins remained. "Look, we know you're mad at us," George said without preamble. "But you got to understand, we didn't mean to screw up the plan with Umbridge." Harry observed him critically. "Then explain to me what it was that you meant to do." Harry had not talked to them since their half-assed confession a week ago. He'd been too furious to listen. "If it had worked, it would have improved on the plan, more than anything. Except it didn't, of course, so it's a moot point. But you're asking why we tried, and there you are. We were trying to make things better." Harry had been understanding about the twins going off the rails this semester. God knew they had reason to. He'd made allowances, tons and tons of allowances, some of which weren't precisely his to make. But he felt oddly inclined to draw the line when their recklessness started endangering his life as well. He was sure it had been said before, something about friendly fire and biting the hand that fed you. You have to admit that Umbridge would have gone berserk in the most deliciously public way. There it was, a handsome young boggart just waiting on the first-floor landing. We just needed to take her a few steps down, and can you imagine the effect of a boggart on Umbridge pumped full of mindfuck mints? As far as their reasons went, it was the usual. More havoc, more destruction, more humiliation to the enemy. Never mind that the change in plan might cause the entire thing to collapse like a house of cards, because whatever, we're the Weasley twins, and nobody's caught us yet, right? There was grief. There was coping with a giant hole in their life where their father had been, and trying to distract themselves with mindless pranks. And then there was self-destruction and taking others down with them. Harry could no longer condone the latter, as he'd realized he'd been doing all along. "We're not proud of what we've done in retrospect," Fred said. "Don't get us wrong, we didn't mean for everything to go the way it did." "Well, that's a relief," Harry said. "And there I was thinking that you gambled with my life just for shits and giggles." "We didn't gamble with anything," Fred snapped. "You make it sound like we meant to be seen and let that ogre of a prefect take Umbridge down to the greenhouses. And you know we didn't." "My problem isn't that you meant for this to happen," Harry said. "My problem is that you didn't consider that it could happen. You didn't think of the consequences, just as you've been ignoring them this whole semester. And the fact that my life was at stake this time made not a shred of difference to you." "It wasn't like that," George said, looking shaken. "We just didn't think." "But maybe you should have," Harry said. "You could have asked for the Marauder's map back. Then you'd known whether or not anyone else was around, whether you were being followed, or whatever happened. I don't even know. And you know what? I don't care. I'm done with you not thinking. I can't do the thinking for you, and I can't trust you if you don't think." He did trust them, as far as the grand scheme of things went, of course. He trusted them to be on the right side of the war. He trusted their loyalty. He trusted their integrity. He just didn't fully trust their impulse control anymore. "Can't trust us?" Fred repeated. "Can't... What are you saying exactly?" "I'm saying you need to grow up," Harry said, voice hard, "and sort yourselves out. I know it's been difficult, but you either accept that life can be fucking unfair sometimes and go on with your lives, or else you get stuck at this level. This whole semester you've been a danger to yourself and others. Is this the way you want to go on being?" "Yeah, well, easy for you to say," Fred scoffed. But as he met Harry's eyes, his expression faltered. "Oh, yeah," Harry said, watching the realization sink in. "I've no idea what I'm talking about. For me and everyone around me, life's always been a fairy tale with a bunch of fairy tale endings to pick from. I mean, take Neville. His life is a peach, guys." Fred was opening his mouth to say something defensive, Harry was sure. He spoke before that could happen. "It's not a competition for who's got the worst deal. I still sympathize with yours, but I somehow didn't think that, all along, all you wanted to prove was your right to be pitied." Fred flushed a deep crimson and balled his fists. George flinched. "That's not what it's been about." "Then what has it been about? And has this manic crusade been worth it for you?" George gave a awkward half-shrug. Harry sighed. "I hope for your sakes that you know what you're doing. Montague was gloating to me about catching you red-handed and buying you a one-way ticket to Azkaban, and Dumbledore seems to think that this is serious." "Fuck Montague," Fred said. "He can't prove anything." "Dumbledore said—" George started. "Fuck Dumbledore too," Fred said vehemently. "Fuck them all. We'll get through this and we'll be fine." Harry approved of the fighter attitude. He just hoped that it would carry over into the twins finally straightening out their actions somehow. 2 weeks into the world after Harry's fateful duel with Voldemort, and the dust was beginning to settle. The students still gazed at Harry in wonder, but the teachers had stopped. Some of them, of course, had never started, Snape being a prominent one among those. Wild rumours of Harry's duel still flew about, but life went on as usual, and new, more trivial concerns overshadowed his heroic deeds. Overall, Harry didn't think he'd ever enjoyed such good standing with such a huge proportion of the school. A number of Slytherins did violently hate his guts, with good cause, but the times when they could have murdered him and nobody would care were long past. Harry was a national hero these days, after all. The only thing that baffled him was lack of recognition from the Ministry. He'd expected to hear from them in regard to his visit to the Department of Mysteries, and yet there was nothing. He was beginning to fear that his calculations were off somewhere, that Scrimgeour was perhaps not going to offer as many opportunities to Harry as he hoped. Well, it was early days yet. 2 weeks were certainly not enough to propel Harry into contacting them. If things were to play out as he wanted them to, the Ministry had to come crawling to him. "How do you mean?" Neville asked, when Harry mentioned something of his expectations. "I have a feeling," Harry confided, "that the recent triumph over He Must Not Be Named has put me in a, shall we say, string-pullable position. We'll see. But I have hopes." Neville was looking at Harry strangely, but then people did tend to look at him strangely from time to time. They usually got over it. "Funny how sometimes I forget that you're this boy who lived thing," Neville said, "and what it means. You'd think that it's kind of obvious, but I manage to forget all the same." And that was precisely why Harry treasured Neville. There weren't many people left these days who could honestly forget what Harry was in the wider world, because to them it did not matter. The revelation of the prophecy had produced an odd effect on Harry's entire circle of friends. They had been close to him before, but now they were bound together by a deathly secret. These invisible ties drew them together, isolating them in their knowledge from the rest of the world. They were, in their own way, the few chosen ones, the very few, let in on any deeper truth, and they felt aware of their exclusive, almost elevated position. Their ranks closed around Harry, more protectively than before, and even between themselves they experienced a greater mutual understanding than ever, in Harry's opinion. Before now, Harry had been the only real point of their intersections. Cedric was Harry's friend, but not Millicent's. Blaise and Hermione did not talk to one another. The twins had little to say to Anthony, and Padma to Neville. They were all Harry's friends, but nothing else united them. Almost all had their own friends outside of Harry's group. Terry and Anthony had Michael Corner, Padma her wide circle of friends and admirers, Lee Jordan was widely considered the third Weasley twin, and Cedric was certainly popular within his own year. Only Neville and Hermione relied solely on one another. Blaise and Millicent also had no friends outside of Harry. However, none particularly tried to deepen friendships within the group, with the exception of Luna, who was about the most open-minded person in Harry's acquaintance. They were all too different. It could hardly go another way, and Harry was used to how it was. Suddenly, though, things were changing. There was an almost conspiratorial air to the after-dueling club meetings now, no matter what was being discussed, and all of Harry's friends had taken a while to process the prophecy, reacting in their different ways. Anthony and Hermione had, predictably, gone off to do research in order to gain a measure of control over the unstoppable forces of fate. Cedric worried, because he was responsible like that. For some reason, hearing about the prophecy made him even less eager to leave Hogwarts, or perhaps it was leave Harry at Hogwarts. Harry wasn't sure he'd understood Cedric when he'd said, "And the terrifying thing is that nobody will notice anything about you until it's far too late." He'd refused to elaborate on that, so Harry had put the cryptic statement out of his mind. The twins and Harry had not talked since their argument. They didn't attend the meetings either, and a part of Harry was sad about it. But the greater part of him was still too angry with them. He did still number them among his friends when it counted. For now, however, they needed a bit of a break to cool off. Neville had made his peace with the prophecy a long time ago. Padma was trying to decipher its deeper meaning, and Luna was making necklaces of billywig propellers most of the time. Harry, meanwhile, focused on the simple things, his own research into issues that interested him, schoolwork, and dealing with the student population in general and Slytherins in particular. Of these, the last one was arguably the most challenging bit. "Faster, Potter! Come on, are you even trying?" Harry blew hair out of his eyes, annoyed. Montague knew he was trying, and both of them, and their entire fucking team, knew this wasn't about Harry at all, or at least not about his flying ability. This was about Harry's desertion of Voldemort's cause, which he'd never even fucking supported, but sometimes lately, Harry genuinely hated Montague for making him feel as if he had deserted them, nonetheless. "Crab, Goyle, aim those bludgers, Potter. Needs to be woken up a bit. If you can't dodge that, Potter, you're—" "What, off the team? Don't make me laugh, Montague. Who are you going to put as seeker? Malfoy?" Malfoy drew himself up, and Harry focused on him and Montague, and he was not looking at either Crabbe or Goyle, not if he could help it, not even after 3 weeks. 3 weeks of Goyle struck by a shell-shocked kind of grief, as if he hadn't known that violent endings were even a possibility. Well, war was like that. If you supported the wrong side, maybe your dad could die. "Has Dad's death changed anything? This is what I told you about. We will all be ruined by this." Actually, scratch that. Whichever side you supported, someone's dad was going to die. Harry and Goyle both suffered from nightmares, which was ironic in a deeply fucked up way. "I would make a much better seeker than Potter," Malfoy was saying, and Harry wrenched his attention back to him. "You know I could, Ed. I wouldn't mind taking over the spot." "I'll mind," Adrian Pusey said. "We've got to beat Ravenclaw by enough of a margin that I don't care for chucking Potter midway, thank you." "Are you implying that I wouldn't be good enough?" Malfoy demanded. "I think he's referencing the fact that it was me catching the snitch in every single game Slytherin has played since I joined," Harry interjected. "Me, not you. There's a subtle difference there. I'm sure you'll agree." Bletchley turned away, frowning, but Harry knew that there was a reluctant smile lurking behind his expression. He knew because he and Bletchley and Pusey used to have a grand old time making fun of Malfoy back in the day, back when Harry had been one of them, and they'd still thought he might join them and Voldemort. Quidditch used to be rather fun, and Montague much more lenient. They'd actually liked him then, better than Malfoy anyway, although that had taken a while to achieve. Back when he and Malfoy had joined the team, they had both been just equal second years, but Malfoy enjoyed a higher standing by virtue of being a Malfoy. The Quidditchless Triwizard year had upset the balance enough that, in their fifth, Harry was definitely the one on better and closer terms with the Quidditch team. He couldn't honestly say that it was easy adjusting to the backward change. On the other hand, he thought that it wasn't easy for his teammates either. "How do you even know that Potter's not going to throw the game?" Malfoy challenged. "He's defied our Lord. He's fought our Lord. He's betrayed all of us. How can you trust the traitor again? How do you know that he won't throw the game just to spite us all?" Harry grew still at the incredible accusation. So did the others. "Are you insane?" Harry asked, finally. "How does this even relate? This isn't war. This is Slytherin we are talking about. Why would I even—" Montague, Bletchley and Pusey were gazing at him, and out of the corner of his eye Harry saw Crabbe and Goyle staring also. "What could you understand of Slytherin loyalty?" Malfoy asked derisively. "Excuse me?" Harry inquired, feeling anger bubble up in his chest. He thought this had been dealt with a long time ago. How could this even be coming up again? "What would you know of Slytherin loyalty?" Malfoy repeated. "Once a traitor, always a traitor, and you've declared your side now." "A Slytherin does not equal a Death Eater," Harry said coldly. "And I can't believe I have to explain it to you of all people. It's people like you who give Slytherin a bad name, coming up with ridiculous shit that turns the whole school against us." "Oh, don't you try to tell me that the whole school is against you." "No, it's not," Harry said. "The whole school is against you." "I wonder why that is, Malfoy." Maybe the whole thing is not about you being a persecuted Slytherin, because who the fuck are your friends, Malfoy? Not even people on your own side are defending you, are they? Montague, Bletchley, Pusey watched silently. Well, at least they're not defending you anymore, because they've seen you for what you are, a filthy traitor in the end. I may have refused to join the Dark Lord, Harry said, narrowing his eyes at Malfoy. And, shit, somehow in this whole school there was hardly another person who infuriated him quite so much. But I would never do anything that jeopardized Slytherin, and I don't care if you and everybody else wants to think that a true Slytherin is always a Death Eater. You're only making it worse for yourself, Malfoy snarled. What do you think everybody is going to say if their golden boy is still playing Quidditch on the side of the evil Slytherins? Do you think they will applaud this great exercise and all of us getting along? Wake the fuck up to the facts, Potter. You don't belong here. You've been saying that since first year, Harry snapped, and yet I'm still somehow here, aren't I? But he hadn't thought of that, of what everyone would say once they knew that Harry was somehow still getting along with his Quidditch team. It included people with suspected or even known Death Eater ties. Malfoy's father was in prison, for fuck's sake, and yet he and Harry were somehow in this together. This was fucked up, but Harry wasn't leaving. He wasn't leaving Quidditch, one of the few things he was still doing because he loved it, and he wasn't going to let Malfoy win this fight. Let the world think that what it wanted. Harry wasn't budging on this one. He wanted Slytherin to win the Quidditch Cup, and he wanted Slytherin to do well in general, and he wanted to strangle Malfoy for suggesting that he lacked house loyalty. He turned to Montague, fists clenched, jaw tight. So, are we practicing or what? Montague gave him a heavy, measured look. We were, until you and Malfoy decided to disrupt us. For that, you'll both get broom-cleaning duty, and Malfoy, I don't want to hear it. Pick a fight with Potter in your own time, and make sure you can beat him when you do, because, as for now, you've already wasted half an hour of my life. Malfoy was white with fury. And I suppose you're going to say nothing to Potter, then? Just this. Potter, if you are planning to lose us the game, we might temporarily, in a fit of rage, you understand, completely beside ourselves, forget the Dark Lord's orders, and you will die. Are you claiming that you can succeed in killing me better than the Dark Lord can? Harry inquired sharply. My, what heretical thoughts you are entertaining. The junior Death Eaters exchanged discomfited glances, and Harry felt a twisted satisfaction at landing a blow on their own field. It had to be inconvenient for them to have taught their enemy to converse in their language. You think you're clever, Montague growled, but you won't like what's coming to you. Look, Harry held up a hand. You can kick me off the team if you like. He looked Montague in the eyes. But I swear to you that I don't want to lose Slytherin the game. I've never wanted to lose Slytherin any games, and no political situation can change that. I wouldn't do shit like that just to spite you. I don't even want to spite you. He didn't say it, but it was the truth. There were his enemies in the bigger world outside of Hogwarts and Quidditch, and he knew it rationally, but emotions were slower catching up. And Harry had got to know Montague, Pusey and Bletchley back in fourth year properly, and they'd had fun times this year while he was pretending to maybe buy into Voldemort's appeal, and for some reason he could not start disliking them when he needed to, just for them being on different sides, which was fucked up too. Quit standing around, Montague barked. Potter stays until the next match, and that's final. Potter up in the motherfucking air. Crabbe, Goyle, in position with the bludgers. Go! Perhaps bloody Malfoy was right in one respect. This whole war might have been easier on Harry if he hadn't been in Slytherin, and if lines between his friends and enemies had been more clear-cut. Miraculously, you all did quite well in the test, Emmeline Vance said in a cool voice. For this, hardly any credit goes to your previous teacher, so I must commend you for your independent study. The class remained quiet and watchful, but not out of fear like with Ambridge. There was just something in Emily Vance's whole bearing that commanded obedience. You will get your results presently. Professor Vance said, and with a wave of her wand sent the test papers neatly onto each student's desk. Over the holiday you will correct your mistakes and analyze your results in conjunction with last week's practical test, in order to identify your weak areas. You will also write an essay detailing your findings and proposing solutions. She silenced the budding groans with a strict look. There remains 6 weeks until the owls. During this time, you must fill any and all remaining blanks in your knowledge. Daphne Greengrass sighed, looking at her paper. She was probably wondering how she would catch up on her defensive spells, which were consistently a difficulty for her and the dueling club. Not, on the other hand, looked annoyed. Harry wondered how he had kept abreast of the curriculum in the absence of teaching from Umbridge and without access to the dueling club. Perhaps the 7th years were tutoring him and Malfoy now, as they had done with Harry last year. The bell rang at the same exact moment as Emmeline Vance pronounced, "Class dismissed." Then, after a moment, she looked up from her desk and added, "Mr. Potter, please stay behind." Blaise gave Harry a questioning look, but Harry didn't know what this was about. Since assuming her position as defence instructor, Emmeline Vance had not once given an indication that she'd met Harry before at the Order headquarters, and never singled him out in any way. "I'll see you at lunch," Harry said to Blaise and Millie. They left together with the rest of the old Slytherin class, and Harry approached the teacher's desk. "Mr. Potter, as you undoubtedly know, you have not made a single mistake on either of the tests," Emmeline Vance stated, as soon as the door closed behind the last student. "This, together with your performance that I witnessed personally at the Ministry of Magic, indicates to me that you have already mastered the owl study material." "I am flattered you think so, Professor," Harry said, wondering where this was going. Emmeline Vance observed him for a few moments. "Mr. Potter, do you believe that you will draw any benefit at all from attending my classes?" she asked suddenly. "I do not see an advantage in mincing words. You are clearly ahead of your peers, which should create difficulties for both them and you. I must ask you seriously whether you have learned anything of use in the last 2 weeks." In all truth, Harry hadn't. That is, he thought that Emmeline Vance was a good teacher, and she explained theory behind spells in a much more understandable way than dry books ever could, but the problem was that he'd already slaved through the dry books and squeezed information out of them. However, if he'd managed to sit through Umbridge's classes and not die of boredom, he could definitely deal with Emmeline Vance's explanations. He wasn't sure how to phrase that last part inoffensively, though. "I don't want to say that I've mastered the owl material because I've mostly learned through self-study or practice with other students," he chose to say. "I might be missing some crucial parts of the curriculum because I've never gone over them with a teacher." "Without any desire to flatter you, Mr. Potter, I believe that you will have no problems with the practical part of the exam, at the very least." "But the theory—" "Very well," Emmeline Vance nodded. "If you wish to test your theoretical knowledge, I can arrange it so that you would sit a practice theory owl with questions taken from past exams. This should determine your current level." "I'm not sure that I can ask you to make that effort on my behalf, Professor," Harry said. "Please do not think that I am doing this solely, or even mainly, for your benefit, Mr. Potter," Professor Vance said. "Put plainly, you're a disruptive element in my class. Your advanced knowledge discourages your peers, who find it difficult not to make the comparison. It is also quite clear that you are not learning, but only making an appearance in my class." "I'm sorry if I gave you the impression—" "I take it you are not sorry that you are ahead of your age group," Emmeline Vance said impassively. "It did, after all, most likely save your life." Harry shrugged. "And what if I do pass the test, Owl?" "If you pass, you will be tasked with an independent project to be submitted at the end of the year," Emmeline Vance said. "An academic essay on a subject to be determined. Quite naturally, it should relate to defence against the dark arts." Harry inclined his head. "Thank you, Professor." "Have a good holiday, Mr. Potter," the teacher said, dismissing him. "And I advise you to think of research topics to explore." Research topics? Harry had them in droves. Like Voldemort and his previous rising, or then the security and military situation of Wizarding Britain in general, or else Dark wizards who tried to gain power in the past, or else magic itself. Occlumency, legilimency, blood magic, wand magic. Mongolian Amulet of Power, Death Stick Prototype 3, Staff of Merlin Model 14. Power-increasing magic. Harry frowned. Of course, hardly any of this could be explored through legitimate means. Nobody at Hogwarts would let him submit an essay on any of these topics, Harry was sure. Besides which, he wasn't convinced that he wanted to display his areas of interests to anyone connected with the Order. Secret research it would have to be. There were days when Harry worried about someone finding his illegal book stash. He was usually comforted with the thought that he resided in Slytherin, and could therefore always claim that someone had planted the books in his trunk out of spite. Of course his ability to procure forbidden literature had decreased sharply since he'd parted ways with the junior Death Eaters. Harry's close ties with them had provided him with an opportunity to get his hands on many an interesting source. He could not very well buy things from Borgin and Burke's using his own name, but Montague had been willing to pull a few strings. These days Harry was confined to the Hogwarts library until he figured out an alternate means of getting the interesting stuff. Thankfully, the library had enough resources and occlumency thus, so far. Long-standing familiarity with the restricted section had helped Harry to locate the appropriate literature sooner than he might have otherwise. The uninitiated might not have realized that information on the mind arts might be lurking behind the title Elysium of the Enlightened. "Looks like an exciting book you've got there," Terry commented once, peeking at the cover. "What's it for?" "Just an extracurricular project," Harry said. "You know." "Your life is an extracurricular project," Terry informed him. "Hey, at least I keep it fun," Harry rejoined, and they moved on to discussing other things. Harry wouldn't actually say that reading up on occlumency was fun exactly. The exercises suggested in the book weren't all that exciting, but Harry was ready to do whatever it took to master the subject and avoid having either Snape or Dumbledore as his teachers. Whoever thought he'd allow either of them into his mind was clearly delusional. Meanwhile, his readings about Voldemort's first rise and governance of the wizarding world were producing baffling results. He'd read leaflets and manifestos and proclamations, he'd studied treatises and analyses, but somehow the amount of mess in his head was proportional to the amount of literature consumed. At length Harry found that he could no longer read alone in silence, and set about to find someone to debate it all with. His first choice might not have been all that wise in retrospect. "Hermione," he said, casting a soundboard around them, "what do you know about Voldemort's ideology?" Hermione looked up at him in some surprise. That was no wonder. It was not often that Harry sought out her company and hers alone, especially not in the library like this. They normally interacted in a group, with Neville at the very least present also. "Well," Hermione said, putting a bookmark into her tome and closing it neatly, "I know that according to that ideology I am a being best exterminated, as are all muggles and muggle-borns." "Yes, but why?" Harry pressed. "Because muggle blood is polluting the wizard kind," Hermione answered readily. "The quality of magic dilutes, or something like that. In some way or another we bring destruction to the wizarding world. The wizard blood will no longer be pure, which is a very bad thing, according to pure-blood ideology." Harry was frowning. "But the pure-blood ideology and Voldemort's agenda are not entirely one and the same," he said. "And doesn't extermination of all muggle-borns sound a little illogical to you? Surely purebloods cannot keep marrying purebloods only." "Of course it's illogical," Hermione said. "It makes no sense at all." "But then why do you think that so many people bought into it?" Hermione looked at him keenly. "Where are you going with all of this?" "I'm not entirely sure myself," Harry muttered. "Just wanted to hear what you thought. As a muggle-born." Hermione pursed her lips. "A muggle-born, and nobody will let me forget it. Why ask me as a muggle-born? Why not as a fellow witch?" "Because you have a completely different perspective," Harry said, taken by surprise. "You have not grown up in the same world as purebloods, or even most half-bloods, so you have a totally different bias." Hermione's face reflected her incredulity. "And what world did you grow up in? Weren't you raised by muggles, just as I was? Why do you need to ask me what muggle-raised people think?" Harry blinked in momentary confusion. He hadn't associated himself with anything muggle in years. It hadn't even occurred to him to think of himself in those terms, and he cast around for a reason why. "Well, you actually like the muggle world, don't you?" he said aloud, landing upon that very reason, and immediately wished he hadn't. There was an awful look in Hermione's eyes. "You have been friends with purebloods for too long," she said, "or else Slytherin has that effect on people. You've no right, you of all people, you have no right to condemn the muggle world. You know what it's like." "And that's why I condemn it," Harry said, stung. "I've actually lived there, and maybe it was good for you, but it wasn't any good for me." Hermione looked like he'd just slapped her, and he felt a little shocked at the anger he found rolling within himself. He'd thought his miserable years in the muggle world all forgotten. He cringed to remember himself in those days, and tried not to. None of that mattered any more. Long gone was the wide-eyed child who'd expected a benevolent adult to turn up one day and deliver him from suffering. Harry had sorted himself out, and he was doing just fine. Here, in the wizarding world. Harry closed his eyes and told himself that he didn't actually hate all muggles. He knew better than that. He knew that, while he hadn't seen any kindness in the muggle world, perhaps there was some to be found. The entire world could not be as bad as what he had seen. The entire world could not be condemned out of hand, like Harry condemned it from his personal experience. The thing was, he couldn't help the way he felt about it. "Is this why all of your other friends are purebloods?" Hermione asked, her voice unsteady. "Did you, from the beginning, try to distance yourself as far from the muggle world as you possibly could?" Harry wanted to tell her that this wasn't the reason, that he had surrounded himself with purebloods because it would be easier on him in Slytherin, but suddenly he wasn't sure. "I don't know," he said, "but them being purebloods is not why I value them." "I never knew," Hermione said. "I never thought you were like this about muggles." "I'm not in any way about muggles," Harry said. "I don't want to kill them all, or anything. It's... Never mind." Hermione slowly collected her books, and Harry wondered when was the last time either of them had seen the other so unguarded in their feelings. Perhaps it was back in third year, when they'd had their fight about her time-turner. It always seemed to take a fight. "Look, I'm sorry," Harry started, but then Hermione spoke. "Why did you start this whole conversation?" she asked quietly. "What did you hope to gain?" "I've been reading about Voldemort," Harry said, "and I've been wondering how other people saw it, that's all. And you're clever," he added, lips quirking up in a smile. "You had to have interesting thoughts." Hermione's face didn't outwardly change, but Harry could tell that she was no longer angry. "It seems that I don't," she said. "I think you didn't find out what you hoped to. I'm afraid I haven't looked into it much. It was somehow enough that I knew Voldemort to be unquestionably wrong." "Yes, for me too," Harry muttered. "Up to a point." "And now what?" she inquired. "You don't think he's so wrong any more?" Harry shrugged. He was still sure that Voldemort was wrong. He just wanted someone to explain why people followed him despite that. Blaise was very much the wrong person to approach about this. Blaise, with his known pure-blood bias, anti-muggle sentiment, and complete lack of morals. Harry knew it, but he ended up talking to Blaise anyway. Not that he'd wanted it to happen. It was just one day by the lake, when Blaise was also present, Padma delved into Harry's school bag and fished out a book she should never have laid her hands upon. "Oh, what's this?" she asked, glancing at the boring cover. "Why would you read... Wow, this looks complicated." Harry froze when he turned around and saw her with that book, and for the life of him he could not have got it from Padma before Blaise leaned over. "What's that? Oh," he said, voice suddenly flat. "Give that to me, you insufferable woman. Don't you know that curiosity killed a cat?" "And lack of chivalry will kill your dating prospects," Padma rejoined, pouting. "That could have been interesting." "No, it couldn't," Blaise said, closing the book. "Here, Harry, catch." Padma didn't see the look on Blaise's face right then, but Harry read it loud and clear. He'd rarely before seen Blaise truly serious. Blaise had held out with the questions until they were safe and sound-warded in the slithering common room. "What in the world," he said, "are you doing with that in your possession at Hogwarts, Harry?" "It's not like I'm prancing around Hogwarts casting unforgivables," Harry said. "It's only a book. I can get rid of it any time." "And if you're caught with it, like you nearly were today?" "Padma wouldn't have known what it was," Harry said. "I'm not even sure how you do." Blaise looked at Harry for some time, then gave a shrug. "Your reading choices surprise me. I applaud you. I'm not an easy man to surprise." "I live to serve," Harry murmured. "So how much of this manifest of the Dark Lord's path have you read and understood?" Blaise asked, seemingly offhand. "Or perhaps I should ask, just how deep did your Death Eater initiation go? It seems that we all underestimated the influence a Montague could have on a young, impressionable mind." There were two ways to go at this juncture. Harry could shrug Blaise off, or else he could draw him into a real discussion. He knew he had to do the former. He ended up choosing the latter, because no matter what else he was, in this area at least, Blaise would be knowledgeable. "I thought initially that the whole conflict was about the Dark Lord and Dumbledore being at ideological odds," Harry said, "with the Ministry being just sort of by the by. But now it seems to me that the Dark Lord, and certainly the attending purebloods, were opposing the Ministry and the role it was playing, and Dumbledore was propping the Ministry up. At least that's the only way I can understand this whole thing, that the whole issue is about what the Ministry should be and do, because it doesn't add up otherwise. All the Ministry posts that Dumbledore holds and the influence he has, this whole wizarding world would not be the way it is now if Dumbledore did not want it to be this way, at least partially." "Yes," Blaise said. "Yes, this whole conflict is not very obvious on the surface, is it?" "It's not," Harry said, frowning. "Mostly because, on the surface, it seems to be about Muggleborns, and there is a conflict about Muggleborns, but I don't think it's the main thing anymore." "Ah!" Blaise sat up, looking more animated than Harry ever saw him. "You do understand?" "No, I don't. I'm getting confused. Who thinks what about Muggles and Muggleborns?" "Confused how?" Blaise asked. "Dumbledore was called a Muggle lover, but he's not pushing for any adaptation programs that I can see. He's just for freely admitting Muggleborns into our world. The Ministry doesn't seem to have any legislation on them, positive or negative. On the other hand, I don't believe that the purebloods can possibly want to kill all Muggles. That's not practical, and the wizarding world would die out. I know that when the Dark Lord was rising, Muggleborns looked like they were flooding the wizarding world with their numbers, wanting to change the wizarding world to be more like the Muggle one, and that the Dark Lord played on those fears. I don't see what he suggests as a solution." "These fears are still very real," Blaise said. "The pureblood families are dying out, that's obvious, and the mudbloods are coming in. They want change and equality, but to them it means just what you said, making the wizarding world more like the Muggle, and that counts a lot when they have to have a say in how the Ministry is run. When they get to have a say in how the Ministry is run, they're completely missing the point of what the Ministry is supposed to be about." "What is it supposed to be about, then?" "The Ministry was founded upon signing the Statute of Secrecy for the purpose of concealing magic from Muggles. It was not about governance, not about controlling the population, and for Merlin's sake, not even nearly about controlling magic. They've grown like a parasite and have tried to encroach on about every part of our lives, to the point that even learning is institutionalized. How they're expecting to progress while stifling the life out of out of us all, I have no idea." Harry eyed Blaise warily. He'd never heard Blaise speak in such an impassioned tone. A lot of what Blaise said he'd already figured out from his readings, more or less, including the way the Ministry of Magic had expanded over the last 300 years. Established amid witch hunts, in fact, the Statute of Secrecy was signed in the year of the Salem witch trials. The Ministry's purpose had been, at the start, to keep magic users from displaying magic to muggles. But then slowly and always with a good excuse, its powers had expanded. Gradually it had acquired auras to enforce rules, and a judiciary to try offenders, and a prison to put them away. The Ministry had needed a department for controlling magical creatures that could reveal the wizard's existence. They had grown to outlaw keeping some creatures in private homes. They had founded a department of games and sports in order to keep track of Quidditch, lest it be seen by muggles. Of course there had also had to be a department for cooperating internationally with other signatories of the statute. Obliviators had to be controlled by the Ministry. Then there had remained only a step towards controlling Hogwarts' curriculum and demanding that new spells be approved by the Ministry in order to be deemed legal. It seemed that the wizards had never truly agreed to the existence of the Ministry as a whole. It had just sort of happened, and its very nature precipitated a number of oddities. It seemed very strange to Harry, for example, that the wizarding world had no standing army. He remembered back from Muggle school that countries always had armies, but the Ministry only had domestic police forces. However, later he realized that unless wizards wanted to break the Statute of Secrecy, there could be no wars between nations. It seemed that back before the separation, wizards would participate in Muggle wars. The Muggles would have the numbers and the wizards the power. But after the separation it became impossible. The wizarding world, apart from anything else, did not have enough people to have a true army, but it was a weird society in which every single person was a potential combatant, because every single person over 11 years of age carried a weapon. Harry thought it was similar to the Muggle world a very long time ago, when it had been completely normal for everybody to have swords and pistols and fight duels to their heart's content. In certain ways, before the separation in 1692, the societies must not have been all that different. They had grown apart, of course, since. Harry did not acquire all that knowledge from listening to Professor Binns' lectures, nor from reading ministry-sanctioned literature. He wasn't sure just how heretical his views were, according to the Ministry, or what Dumbledore would have said of all of this. Inevitably, of course, it made him feel like he understood even less about the war than he had before he'd started reading about it. Hermione's words rang out clear in his mind. It was easier to be content in the knowledge that Voldemort was simply wrong, and discount any points his followers had to make. "Killing off all Muggles and Muggleborns is not the way to go about fixing anything," Harry said, grasping onto the one thing he was sure of. "It's not that I don't see what you're saying," he added, seeing Blaise's look. "I just can't believe that anyone would seriously consider getting rid of the Muggle element a solution to this problem. You said it yourself, the old pureblood families are dying out. They die out, and what then?" "Surely you see that the issue is not in the Muggleborns as such, but in the Statute of Secrecy that prevents them from knowing anything about the wizarding world before they enter it," Blaise said calmly. "Salazar Slytherin was protesting the Muggleborn's presence at Hogwarts 1,000 years ago," Harry countered, incredulous. "You're not going to make this a recent issue, are you?" "He was protesting what he saw as a danger then," Blaise said. "If he saw what's going on now, he'd turn in his grave. Do try to use your imagination, Harry. How much of a problem would the Muggleborns be if they knew in advance about the wizarding world? How much more different would the wizarding world be if not so disconnected from the Muggle one?" "But you can't abolish the Statute of Secrecy," Harry said. "Too much hinges on it. Who knows what will happen if you expose the wizarding world to Muggles? There might be a war, or something like that. I mean, not necessarily, but Muggles don't believe in magic. They'll think we're all aliens, or something." "And therein lies the problem," Blaise summed up. "The wizards are tired of living in fear of exposure to Muggles, and the enforced separation is making wizards resent Muggles more, if I'm honest with you. History shows that once upon a time even the purest families intermarried with Muggles. That's all gone now. The Muggleborns try to change the wizarding world in ways they see fit, but that's not just making things worse. The Ministry is set on maintaining the status quo, and something, somewhere, has to change. It sounded to Harry as if Blaise believed what he was saying, and what he was saying was believable enough to be sure. "So, what do you personally think?" he asked. "I agree with what the Dark Lord says about the situation being untenable," Blaise said promptly. "And fuck you, Harry, if you try to pretend at this stage that you don't." "He says a lot more than that these days," Harry said, feeling surreal. "He may have started out with the stuff you're talking about in the 70s, but he's gone far beyond that now. His followers think Muggle hunting should be a sport. He wants to kill me. I don't agree with that." "Neither do I," Blaise said calmly. "And isn't that why I'm here?" For the first time Harry wasn't sure. Suddenly he could see himself on the giant chessboard of this war, a figure of the white set, but fully cognizant of the goals of the black pieces, and even somewhat sympathetic to them. Did Blaise see the same thing? Had he seen it from the start? Had other people? And if so, what were they expecting of Harry? During the first week of the Easter holidays at lunchtime, George stopped by the Slytherin table and dropped an envelope onto Harry's plate. "Here," he said. "Enjoy." This was the most interaction Harry had had with either of the twins since their argument. He supposed this was progress nonetheless. "Thanks," he said to George's retreating back. "What was that about?" Millicent inquired. "I have not the foggiest clue, Millie dear," Harry said, and dodged her punch. "Let's see." He took the envelope and cast an unobtrusive non-verbal charm. Apparently nobody had interfered with the letter since it had been sealed by the sender. How nice. And the sender, it turned out, was most singular indeed. None other than good old Percy Weasley, whom Harry had seen neither hide nor hair of since Christmas. "Harry," the letter read, "you might be surprised to receive communication from me, especially delivered in such a fashion. However, I fear that these measures are necessary under the circumstances. We have tried to contact you through different means, but I am not sure that you even know that Mr. Scrimger has been keen to speak to you ever since he became minister. At Hogwarts you are as if in an impenetrable fortress, and no messages seem to reach you. Mr. Scrimger has attempted to arrange with Dumbledore to see you, but you are apparently not to be bothered. And yet I find it difficult to believe that, if asked directly, you would refuse to meet with the most important man in the wizarding world. You need not fear any ill treatment on the part of the minister. The days of suspicion are past. The ministry understands that it had misjudged you most grievously, and wishes nothing more than to seek reconciliation with you. Minister Scrimger is sure that you and he would be able to have fruitful conversation, which would be beneficial to both of you. Knowing of the close ties between you and my family, he acts through me in order to arrange for a meeting. You are of course quite free to refuse, but it would be preferable to hear your refusal from you, with your own reasons, rather than be turned away at the very Hogwarts gate by the headmaster. Verily, I feel that he takes too much upon himself in this instance. I trust you will agree with me. Enclosed in this envelope is a message from Minister Scrimger himself. Please reply to it as soon as it is convenient for you through the same means as this letter was delivered. It seems to be the safest way. Sincerely yours, Percival Ignatius Weasley. Interesting, Harry said. One might almost say intriguing. So, what is it? Millie repeated. I'll tell you in a sec, Harry promised. He found Scrimger's missive to be much more succinct than Percy's epistle. The minister directly stated his desire to meet Harry, trusting that the young Weasley will have explained everything to you. He had proposed a meeting in Hogsmeade during the holidays, when the students were bound to get their last Hogsmeade weekend of the year. Excellent, Harry said. He then proceeded to charm both letters to look like newspaper clippings about the latest advances in neuromagical dentistry. One wouldn't want to leave sensitive communications lying around unprotected after all. That done, he handed the sheets to Blaze and Millie, one to each, and got up. He'd have some twins to hunt down soon. "So," Fred said. "So," Harry intoned. He was glad to see they were still on the same wavelength. "I usually hate tearful reunions," George said, once the pause stretched on for a few moments longer than anyone could stand. "But this is very touching." The silence that followed was almost as long as the one before it. "I'm glad we've got so much to say to one another," George continued brightly. "It would be a shame otherwise." It was a shame that they had degenerated to this, but at least they were still talking. It would be worse yet if they'd severed ties completely. "Would you mind posting this to Percy for me?" Harry inquired at last. Fred looked at the letter in Harry's hand. "May we know what this is all about? Or can you not trust us with such information?" "Don't be stupid," Harry said. "Of course you may know. I'm writing to Scrimger." A shocked little pause followed this pronouncement. "But of course," George said. "That explains everything." Harry sighed, wishing he'd taken Percy's missive along. "He requests a meeting. I'm happily obliging." "I must have missed that announcement about you being best pals with the minister," George said. "I didn't realize that you liked him now. We've forgiven the ministry for everything, have we?" "To about the same extent as I've forgiven the students of this school for thinking me the heir of Slytherin," Harry said, "and for turning against me during the Triwizard Tournament. Let's keep things in perspective." "A true second chances kind of guy, aren't you?" Fred said. Harry shrugged. "Will you post it or not?" "Sure," George said. "No problems." "Thanks." The letter exchanged hands. Harry wished this wasn't so excruciatingly awkward. This emotional crap, he was bad at it. After a few more moments of silence, Harry was ready to break it and take his leave, but then suddenly Fred spoke. "We've thought about what you said," he informed Harry offhandedly. "In between cursing your name, you understand," George added. "Please don't think you got off lightly." "We've taken all that money from you," Fred continued, "to open the joke shop, but we're kind of not really in a joking mood at the moment. Funny how that happens." Harry started. He'd honestly forgotten about that money. If they were planning to give it back, so help him. "So we were thinking perhaps we could do other stuff with it," Fred said. "Stuff that might be a bit more useful to the war. We're pretty good at destroying things. We figured destroying Death Eaters might be more satisfying than destroying school property." Harry stared at them. "You're suggesting weapons?" "Why, would you not trust us with them?" Fred snapped. Harry winced. "Look, forget I said that," he uttered. "That's not how I meant it. I mean, I know you could only take it one way, but that's not what I meant." "Do you mean you're sorry for saying it?" George asked, eyeing Harry shrewdly. "Not if it made you look into the future and plan shit," Harry said, but then sobered. "But yeah, I shouldn't have said that. I'm sure I could have found some other way to deliver the same message if I hadn't been so mad at you." "Hey, don't beat yourself up too hard," George said. "You might crush yourself, but then who's left to vanquish you-know-who?" "You are, clearly," Harry supplied, "with your weapons of choice. Seriously, though, your idea sounds pretty damn cool." "Doesn't it just?" George agreed. There was no smiling or joking around. In fact, there was nothing beyond the strained civility that was typical after an argument, and Fred was still not fully looking Harry in the eye, but Harry walked away from this meeting feeling unexpectedly more optimistic about their prospects than he'd been in months. Now he only needed to exert whatever political pressure he could to make sure that their future careers would not come to a halt in Azkaban, after all. From the first moments of the meeting, Scrimger struck Harry as someone both on the lookout for improving the ministry's reputation and not particularly adept at smooth-talking. "So, Harry," he said, after a few platitudes regarding the charm and ambience of the private three-broomsticks parlour they were at. "I must admit the rumours about you pale in comparison to what you were seen to achieve. Defeat he who must not be named, with magics nobody has yet identified, and that at just 15. It is only understandable that the public are going wild about you." He looked a little like a wise and grizzled old lion, contemplating the follies of the world. Harry nodded, all polite attention. "Of course, it is perfectly reasonable that in these dark times the people would turn towards one who appears to be their saviour," Scrimger continued. "It is, in all truth, not entirely relevant whether or not you are to save the world from he who must not be named. It is the perception, in this instance, that matters." Harry wasn't sure what expression to plant on his face at this pronouncement, confusion or understanding, so he feared he ended up looking quite stony. "Of course, to you it would matter a great deal whether or not you will be the one who defeat he who must not be named," Scrimger hurried to add. "However, the public, for now, just needs somebody to believe in. It is incredible to what extent just the thought of you raises the public morale. If you were to stand along the ministry at this moment, you would do a great service to our entire community." "I could hardly resist such a call of duty," Harry said seriously. "I would be too modest in saying that I have not noticed the vastly improved press I've been receiving. To think that I can give back to the society that embraces me so warmly, it gives me immense satisfaction." Scrimger grimaced slightly, catching the jibe aimed at the ministry for their abruptly stopped slander campaign. "My predecessor seems to have misjudged you completely. For that you have our sincere apologies." "I'm sure there's no need to remember the past now that we've turned a new leaf," Harry said cheerfully. "I only wonder exactly what would be needed of me to show my support for the ministry. I mean, of course I am ready to do my best, but I am not entirely sure I understand—" "Oh, nothing too onerous," the minister assured him. "If you were just to pop in and out of the ministry once in a while, give an interview or two, things like that, it would send exactly the kind of message the public needs." "I see," Harry said. "That does sound quite doable." He bit his lip. "Only, well—" "Yes, what is it?" Scrimger inquired. "There are a couple of things that still trouble me as regards the ministry's actions, but I'm sure the ministry will recognise that they also belong in the past, with the old mistakes." "What actions do you speak of?" Scrimger asked, frowning. "Well, for one thing, someone at the ministry seems to believe that my friends Fred and George Weasley are somehow to blame for the tragic nervous breakdown suffered by Madame Umbridge," Harry said, his very tone projecting his complete incomprehension at such a claim. "I have yet to hear of this," Scrimger said, looking somewhat befuddled. "This, then, must be a misunderstanding," Harry said. "I shall rest safe in knowing that, should such a complaint come to the minister's desk, you will reject it as obviously false." Something in Scrimger's body language changed subtly. All of a sudden, he was sitting a bit straighter and peering at Harry a little closer. "Yes," he murmured, eyes a lot more alert than before. "You may be safe in knowing that the Weasley brothers are safe from prosecution on this score. You had some other concerns?" Harry did, actually. For one thing, his godfather Sirius Black was currently held in the ministry cells, awaiting return to Azkaban, but he'd been wrongly imprisoned due to what had to be a tragic misunderstanding. Harry was sure something could be done about that. If nothing else, he'd ask the minister to request pensive memories from Sirius Black as proof, and keep an open mind when dealing with that case. Hopefully, his and Dumbledore's combined pressure would do enough to produce results. The minister was clearly displeased with this request, but he couldn't say no outright, if he wanted to keep Harry happy. And he wanted to keep Harry happy. Or else, who knew, Harry might figure that allying with the ministry would be too troublesome after all. "I was also thinking," Harry said, "that it might be in your power to make this arrangement still more beneficial to us both, Minister." "Oh, yes?" Scrimger inquired, with the appearance of a person developing acute toothache. Harry wondered whether Scrimger had expected how prepared Harry would be for this conversation, and just how easy thought this would be. Harry might be the boy who lived, but he was a 15-year-old kid after all. Surely he'd quail before the might of the Minister for Magic himself. Sadly for Scrimger, Harry had dealt with bigger fish than him in the past. "Well, if I'm to be popping in and out of the ministry, perhaps I could make good use of my time there," Harry suggested. "The opportunities for furthering my studies—" "Oh, I see," Scrimger said, clearly relieved that Harry was not demanding any more pardons for criminals. "You had something specific in mind?" As it happened, Harry did. Apparition, for instance, would be an incredibly useful skill for him to learn. Harry would be ever so eager to commence this learning process ahead of his peer group. After all, his were exceptional circumstances, and he'd felt much better knowing that he'd have an escape route beyond Portkeys. Not that he was paranoid, but a Dark Lord was after him. "Of course, my dear boy," Scrimger said genially. "Consider it done. A tutor will be arranged for you for your first visit to the ministry. Shall we say in 2 weeks? There will be a press conference to address some of the public concerns. If you were to make an appearance, that would be most excellent timing." With an inward sigh, Harry assented. It seemed that he had 2 weeks of calm before Dumbledore and the Order found out that he'd chosen to go against their wishes and ally himself publicly with the ministry. Whatever information Dumbledore still had to impart to him, Harry had a feeling he'd better listen to it before the revelation struck. Scrimger seemed to be thinking along the same lines. "How are you planning to get out of the castle?" he inquired. "I'm sure that unfortunately the headmaster will be against your decision to stand by the ministry." "I should have a perfectly plausible reason for going," Harry said. "My defense professor is planning to arrange for a practice owl test for me. If that were to fall on the same date—" Scrimger was already nodding. "I shall try to arrange things accordingly. May I just say, I can already feel it's going to be a pleasure to work with you, Mr. Potter." Harry could just bet. They agreed that their correspondence would continue through the Weasleys, and that nothing should be done until Harry's first visit could be organised. After that, the cat would be out of the bag. It would be too late for Dumbledore or anyone else to try and dissuade Harry or prohibit him from expressing his views. Being an intelligent man, Scrimger did not ask Harry whether he did actually uphold the views he was going to support. Harry had agreed to improve the ministry's public image. That was all that mattered for now. The only thing Scrimger asked in the last moments of the meeting. Does your decision mean that you are not, perhaps, as close to Dumbledore as he would suggest?" Harry only shrugged to that. What business was it of Scrimger's what it meant? The minister harumphed, watching him closely. "A bit of a dark horse, aren't you, Harry?" he asked rhetorically. "One didn't know quite what to expect, what with— well, there is not much information about you, and that's contradictory. Our own fault, I suppose, to an extent," he sighed. "But no matter. We shall not make the mistake of underestimating you again." Why did that to Harry sound more ominous than apologetic? Profoundly aware that he had only 2 weeks of being in the assuredly good graces of Professor Dumbledore, Harry requested a meeting at Dumbledore's earliest convenience. The headmaster agreed to meet him the following Thursday. Only a few days had elapsed since Harry's meeting with Scrimger, and another few remained until the end of the holidays. Harry had the feeling that events around him were unfolding faster than he could fully process them, that is to say, at their usual pace. "I'm glad to see you looking so well, Harry," Dumbledore said, once he and Harry were sitting on opposite sides of his desk. Instruments of unknown function purred tinnily around the office. Harry glanced at Fawkes, but the phoenix seemed to be asleep. "I understand you have experienced no consequences at all of the duel at the ministry?" the headmaster asked. "No dizziness? No odd headaches? Very well, then let us proceed." He steepled his fingers and regarded Harry over his glasses. "Tell me, Harry, have you ever heard of Horcruxes?" Was that a trick question? A moment's hesitation gave Harry away. Dumbledore's face darkened almost imperceptibly. "So you have." "I don't know what they are," Harry said. "I've just seen the word before. Judging by the context, they are quite dark magic. but I've never looked into them."
"As irony would have it, what you have not learned on your own I shall have to tell you," Dumbledore said.
Just by confessing to have encountered the word, Harry probably gave Dumbledore a pretty sound idea of what he'd been reading. Oh, well, it wasn't like Dumbledore could really do anything about it.
"A Horcrux," Dumbledore continued, "is a fragment of a soul torn away from the whole through the act of murder and deposited for safekeeping in a separate container. A man who has created a Horcrux cannot die as long as his Horcrux is secure. It is a safeguard against death for those willing to take such a deeply damaging path."
But Harry was no longer listening. "Fragment of a soul torn away," he repeated.
"Yes."
"In a separate container?"
"Yes."
"So not at all what I was then? What I was when I had a fragment of Voldemort's soul inside me, then?" Was this what this discussion was going to be about? More repercussions, more random shit that connected Harry to Voldemort? Dumbledore looked suddenly pained and sympathetic. But Harry didn't want sympathy. He wanted answers. He'd apparently wanted those answers for a year already, ever since the last task of the Triwizard Tournament. He just hadn't known.
"You are correct, of course," Dumbledore said. "In a most technical sense, you could be considered a former Horcrux. However, please understand that the creation of a Horcrux involves much more than what occurred during the relocation of Voldemort's soul fragment into your body. If you were a Horcrux, you were the most accidental and unorthodox, and Voldemort had no notion of it."
"It's a great comfort to me, I'm sure," Harry said.
"It should be," Dumbledore agreed serenely. "For can you imagine the sort of existence you would face if Voldemort was aware of your immeasurable importance to him? He did not know, when he captured you in your 4th year, that this main priority was to keep you alive. But if he had known—"
Harry wasn't even going to contemplate that scenario. "Does that mean," he asked instead, "that your main priority until then was to make sure that I'd die?"
"Harry—"
"Well, if I was keeping Voldemort alive as long as I lived, surely, at one point, you had to make sure I died. But wait, I forgot about the prophecy. How does that even work together?" Dumbledore sighed.
"Please do not assume that I have always possessed the knowledge I am sharing with you now. For some time I had suspicions that you might be something of an accidental Horcrux, and they only grew with the discovery of your Parseltongue ability. However, until you told me it was gone, I had not known for a true fact that you had had a fragment of Voldemort's soul inside your body, nor had I planned to act on it."
Harry didn't know whether he believed it or not, but he supposed that entertaining an argument would be futile. It made no difference any more after all. The soul fragment inside him was gone, so killing him wasn't an issue. All water under the bridge. Kind of tinged with red and metallic to the taste, but no matter.
"The expulsion of Voldemort's soul from your body at the end of your 4th year told me that my suspicions had been correct. At the same time, it offered further proof to a theory I had been entertaining. For Voldemort's soul to break apart in this manner, and for Voldemort to be so unaware of it, his soul had to be wholly, awfully unstable."
He made a pause, but Harry couldn't catch the significance.
"I suspected that Voldemort had made multiple Horcruxes prior to attacking you that Halloween," Dumbledore said softly. "More than one, which was all any other wizard had dared to do. I could not be certain of the number, but I was almost sure there were several. I'd, after all, already seen one destroyed by then."
"You destroyed one of his Horcruxes?"
"No, you did."
Harry just stared.
"In your 2nd year, when you showed me that diary," Dumbledore said, "I recognized it to be an immensely powerful and extremely dark object. I had very rarely held anything so steeped in the most awful magic. It was no longer potent, but I could feel the traces that I had felt vaguely once before, on you, just after you were taken from the rubble of your home."
Harry repressed an involuntary shudder. "Why was it so powerful in the diary, but not in me?" he asked. "The soul fragment, I mean. It got to control Ginny Weasley fully, but I've never felt a single thing from that soul. Unless he hadn't noticed feeling it, unless he'd mistaken the urgings of a foreign soul for his own desires.
We may never quite know, but I believe the answer lies in the protection that your mother gave you, Dumbledore replied.
Lily's sacrifice was also the reason why your soul and Voldemort stayed separate. It kept a barrier between them, of sorts. Yes, Harry said, shaking off the memory. I understand. So, the Horcruxes, how many did you say there were, sir?
I truly do not know, Harry. There is a person who very well might. I shall do my utmost best to persuade him to come to Hogwarts next year. He steadily avoided me whilst the Ministry was against us, but I hope that he will reconsider. It is also my belief that he would give up that information to you much more readily than he would to me.
Why would that be, Professor? Dumbledore's countenance remained enigmatic.
In you he might see a chance to remedy his old mistakes.
Harry couldn't truthfully say that he'd understood that, but that wasn't really the issue right now. So, until we know how many Horcruxes exist, can we just assume that there might be a massive number of them? In his mind's eye, Harry saw already mounds of Horcruxes spread all over the world, drowning them in the sheer impossibility of the task.
I believe that Voldemort has made a larger number than anybody else, but there is a certain limit beyond which even the bravest man would not, I imagine, dare to split his soul, Dumbledore responded. Creating one Horcrux is already a deed of unthinkably dark and perverse a nature. Creating more is simply no longer safe. In his quest to acquire immortality, Voldemort could obliterate his very self. Indeed, his soul was already so unstable at the time when he attacked you that he did not notice a piece escaping.
Harry cocked his head to the side. But wouldn't that mean that he might really have a huge number of Horcruxes? If his soul was really so unstable that it would split with every murder and attach itself all over the place. Dumbledore smiled.
Harry, you have to realize that your situation is very much the exception. The circumstances of your encounter with Voldemort on the night he attacked you are quite unique in history and are unlikely to ever be repeated again. You may be safe in assuming that Voldemort has only the Horcruxes he has deliberately created, apart from you. And it is more telling still that the soul fragment in you was also destroyed by him in his ignorance.
Harry nodded slowly. So, this is what it would take to defeat him, he said, trying to adjust to the idea. Once the Horcruxes are gone, he will be mortal again.
Yes,
Dumbledore confirmed.
He will, indeed.
It seemed a little easier said than done, though. But how does one find Horcruxes? Harry asked. Or destroy them? And how do we even know what they are? Never mind their number, they could be anything, anywhere, couldn't they?
I do not know precisely what they are, but I have several guesses as to what they might be.
Dumbledore held up a hand to forestall Harry's questions.
I do intend to tell you, in fact. I intend to show you. Show you what I know, the results of my research over the years, so that you might make your own conclusions. But we shall not do it today. This is a long project, Harry. You and I have many a meeting to come, I assure you.
Harry thought of the impeding revelation that he was going to publicly side with the Ministry. Hopefully Dumbledore's desire to share would not be affected by Harry's choices. For now, though, are there any books that I could read to find out more about Horcruxes? Harry asked cautiously. Just to know what they are like, and how to destroy them? The expression in Dumbledore's eyes didn't change, but Harry had the distinct feeling that he was being assessed.
Rest assured, Harry, that I shall give you all the relevant information about Horcruxes, the headmaster said at length. These are not the times for concealment. It is indeed important for you to know the details of the task that lies before us.
And yet he chose not to trust Harry with books. The only information he was willing to share would be filtered through him, so that Harry might not learn too much. Clearly, and just as Harry had expected, Dumbledore was wary of letting Harry close to dark magic, lest Harry be tempted or tainted, or some other bullshit like that. Being right in this instance left Harry with a sense of resentment. rather than vindication, somehow.
"Witches and wizards!" the announcer called out in an excited voice. "Let me present to you Harry Potter!" Camera flashes went off, the crowd roared, and Scrimgeour smiled benevolently next to Harry. Harry inclined his head modestly and waved at the congregated populace. The sea of faces was blurry before him from the lights, and he couldn't hear individual shouts amid the noise, but he didn't need to. They loved him at the moment, that he knew for sure. As he smiled and waved, his thoughts were on the recently concluded press conference. He was getting used to them, but sometimes he still doubted that he'd said the right thing. It felt good to bring Lockhart down a peg, but had it been wise? Had Harry been too evasive on the question of his family? And damn, had his conversation with Amelia Bones not been overheard? He'd never have erred his relationship with Susan. "Well done, dear boy," Scrimgeour had said quietly. "You are doing magnificently." The Ministry was enjoying a great boost of confidence from the wizarding population. Hiring Harry as their mascot had indeed brought a public relations victory. The wizarding world seemed somehow more united and less politically apathetic than it had been. Suddenly everyone was worried for their common future. Everyone felt it was their duty to stand by Harry Potter and the Ministry. Everyone was ready to rise to the defence of the glorious nation against he who must not be named and his rule of terror. Harry was a little baffled that a 15-year-old kid with a funky scar could create these results, but that was the way of the wizarding public. "Belief is very important for wizards, and you, Harry, are a miracle. It is easy to believe in you, if you allow it." Harry allowed it, despite the criticism it garnered from his own allies. "I can't believe that you would do this," Bill Weasley told him. "After all the shit this year, had you just roll over and accept them?" "The crucial detail is in who is rolling over for whom," Harry replied coolly. "Has it occurred to you that you might be misreading the situation?" It had not. It was obvious that the Order believed Harry to have fallen for the Ministry's promises, bitten off more than he could chew, bought into his own myth. "You're advanced for your age, but don't get carried away playing the hero," Emmeline Vance advised coldly. "With James for a father and Sirius for a godfather, it's hard to defy the heritage for recklessness, but this is not a game, Harry," Lupin cautioned. "The Ministry will not stand by you forever," Daedalus Diggle tried to explain. "They will betray you again whenever it suits them. It is sad, but true." Very few people seemed to understand that Harry didn't need any of these condescending warnings. Funnily enough, Snape was one of them. "Don't let Potter mislead you into believing him to be the injured party," he told the Order, to their great consternation. "A fool he might be, but he'll make greater fools of you if you think for a moment that he had not aimed for this to happen the way it did." But then Snape knew much more about Harry than the rest, being his head of house. He'd seen and heard more of his activities than even Dumbledore. Harry was still unsure how much he reported to the headmaster, but some things were impossible to hide. Like the fact that Harry had long been on friendly terms with students who planned to become Death Eaters, and still remained on non-belligerent standing with them, enough to stay on the same Quidditch team. The Quidditch Cup installed in Snape's office for yet another year bore testament to their continued cooperation. "Why did you do this?" Tonks asked Harry, being about the only person to do so. "Why ally with the Ministry? Don't you understand that they're completely unscrupulous?" "I still support what the Order is doing," Harry said. "I just believe that the Ministry has a much wider reach. It might not always have the right methods, but as far as uniting the wizarding world against Voldemort goes, the Ministry has a much better shot at it than the Order ever will. No offence." But they did take offence. Almost the entire Order felt affronted by Harry's decision, as if he owed them something. But he'd never promised to do things their way, or Dumbledore's way. "You display in the spirit of independence very strongly, Harry," Dumbledore said, and only his eyes expressed his ire. "It is most commendable, although I cannot help but wish that you had contacted one of your elders before making such important decisions." His displeasure did not carry over into cancelling the sessions of diving into Voldemort's past, but relations between him and Harry had cooled significantly. Like the Order, he seemed to perceive betrayal in Harry's unilateral decision to make a deal with Scrimger. However, in some ways it was preferable to the other sentiment Harry had noticed in them recently, the slow and somewhat horrified realization on the part of some Order members that Harry had in fact created this situation because it suited his goals, and that they had no fucking clue what those goals were. In the end, however, it did not matter. The Order could not withdraw support from him, anyway, because he was the boy who lived. The very purpose of their organization involved sticking by him. The Ministry, on the other hand, could change their minds about Harry at any moment, and Harry wanted to get as much as possible out of the temporary truce. Only the Ministry could make the exceptions for him that he needed, and he had no scruples about exploiting them to the fullest. At age 15, Harry had doors open before him that most wizards never even glimpsed. He walked through the corridors of the Ministry, popping over after lessons on some days, saying hello to Ministry officials like he belonged there. Without any rank or official position, he had risen to the highest echelons of power. The Minister had personally congratulated him on having completed his owls, and he was waltzing in and out of official functions as if he had any business being there. He had not yet persuaded the Minister to drop the trace of him. In fact, he was despairing of ever succeeding in this quest, but his apparition lessons were going swimmingly, and he'd managed to gain supervised access to Order libraries. The Department of Mysteries remained impenetrable, despite the best of Harry's efforts, but he'd received quite a few helpful tips for mastering occlumency from a couple of obliviators he'd talked to. He hadn't dared to even whisper the word Horcrux anywhere in the Ministry's vicinity, aware that the walls had ears, but he was always on the lookout for known sightings of Founder's objects or information on Voldemort's actions, past and present. For once, the world of opportunity was Harry's for the taking. It felt pretty damn good, actually. End of Year 5.